What happens when a beloved country music star sits down for what should be a friendly morning chat, only to face the most disrespectful line of questioning ever caught on live television? In just 41 seconds, one smug comment from the host would trigger a walkout so explosive that the cameras kept rolling as the entire studio fell silent. It started like any other appearance. Blake Shelton walked onto the Good Morning America set with that signature grin, waving to the studio audience who erupted in cheers. He was there to talk about his new album, his tour, and maybe share a few laughs. The kind of interview he had done 100 times before. Easy, friendly, fun. But from the moment Blake sat down across from George Stephanopoulos, something felt different. The energy was off. George barely smiled during the hello. No warmth. No welcome, just a cold stare and a thin-lipped nod as Blake settled into his chair. Blake didn't seem to notice at first. He was his usual charming self, cracking jokes with the crew, thanking everyone for having him. The audience loved him. You could feel it in the room. But George looked like he had somewhere better to be. The interview started simple enough. George asked about the new album. Blake lit up, talking about the songs, the inspiration, how much fun he had recording it. He was genuine, excited. The way artists get when they truly love what they create. The audience clapped. Blake smiled. Then George cut him off mid-sentence. "Let's talk about something more interesting," George said, leaning back in his chair with this look on his face. This smug, superior look. Like Blake's music, the thing he poured his heart into was boring him. Blake's smile faltered for just a second, just a flicker of confusion, but he recovered quick. "Sure, man, what do you want to know?" Blake said, still trying to keep it light. George didn't waste time. "You've been in the spotlight for years now. The voice, the headlines, the drama. Some people say you've become more famous for everything except the music. What do you say to that?" The audience went quiet. You could hear it. That shift, that uncomfortable tension when someone crosses a line but you're not sure if they meant to or not. Blake laughed it off, but you could see his jaw tighten. "Well, George, I think the folks who come to my shows and buy my records would probably disagree with that." It was a perfect answer. Polite, confident, classy. Blake wasn't going to take the bait. He was going to rise above it. But George wasn't done. "Do they, though?" George said, tilting his head like he was talking to a child. "I mean, when was your last real hit? Something that actually mattered?" The air in that studio changed. You could feel it through the screen. The audience shifted in their seats. A few people gasped. One woman in the front row shook her head in disbelief. Blake stared at George, really stared at him. The smile was gone now, completely gone. "Are you serious right now?" Blake asked. His voice was calm, but you could hear the edge creeping in. George shrugged, actually shrugged, like it was a reasonable question. "I'm just asking what a lot of people are thinking. You're here promoting another album, but let's be honest, Blake, your best days are behind you, aren't they?" That was it. That was the moment. The moment where this whole thing went from uncomfortable to unbelievable. Blake leaned forward in his chair. His hands gripped the armrests. His eyes locked onto George's. "My best days are behind me?" Blake repeated slowly, like he couldn't believe the words that just came out of George's mouth. "You want to sit here, on national television, and tell me that my best days are behind me?" George didn't back down. If anything, he doubled down. He had this arrogant little smirk on his face now, like he was enjoying this. I'm just being honest," George said. "Isn't that what journalism is about? Asking the tough questions?" Blake laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you're so angry that laughing is the only thing keeping you from losing it completely. "Tough questions?" Blake said. "Man, there's a difference between tough questions and just being flat out disrespectful." The crew behind the camera started glancing at each other. The producers in the control room were probably losing their minds. But the cameras kept rolling. George leaned forward now too, matching Blake's energy. "Disrespectful? I think you're being a little sensitive, Blake. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you can't handle criticism anymore." Oh, he went there. He really went there. Blake's face went red. Not embarrassed red, angry red. The kind of red where you know someone is about to reach their breaking point. "Criticism?" Blake said, his voice rising now. "You call this criticism? You haven't asked me one real question about my music, my tour, nothing. You've just sat here trying to tear me down for no reason." George crossed his arms. "I'm trying to have a real conversation instead of the usual fluff piece where we all pretend everything is perfect." Blake stood up, just stood right up out of his chair. The audience gasped again, louder this time. George looked surprised for the first time, his smug expression finally cracking. A real conversation? Blake said, standing over George now. You want a real conversation? Then how about you show some respect? How about you treat your guests like human beings instead of punching bags for your ego? George tried to maintain control. You could see him reaching for it, trying to sound authoritative. Blake, sit down. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. He called Blake Shelton dramatic on live television after insulting his career, his legacy, everything he had worked for. Blake shook his head. He looked at George with pure disbelief. Then he looked at the cameras, then back at George. You know what? I'm done, Blake said. I came here to talk about my music, to connect with fans, to have a good time. But I'm not going to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly has no interest in having an actual conversation. George's face went from smug to defensive real quick. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview. Blake laughed again. That same angry laugh. Watch me. He reached up and unclipped his microphone, just ripped it right off his shirt and dropped it on the chair. The thud echoed through the studio. George stood up now too, flustered, trying to regain control of the situation. Blake, come on, don't be childish about this. Childish. Another jab, another insult. George just couldn't help himself. Blake turned to face him one more time. Childish? You've spent this entire interview trying to make me look bad, asking insulting questions, and treating me like I'm some washed-up has-been. And I'm the one being childish? The audience started clapping, slowly at first, then louder. They were clapping for Blake, supporting him. They saw what was happening. They knew George had crossed every line. George heard it too. You could see the panic in his eyes. He was losing the room, losing control, losing everything. Blake, sit down and finish the interview, George demanded, his voice sharp now, not asking, demanding. Blake looked at him like he was crazy. You think you can talk to me like that? You think you can order me around after the way you just acted? George's face went red now too. His mask was slipping. The professional news anchor facade was crumbling, and what was underneath wasn't pretty. I'm the host of this show, George said, pointing at himself. You're a guest. You'll sit down if I tell you to sit down. The entire studio went silent. Even the audience stopped clapping. Everyone was frozen, watching this unbelievable moment unfold. Blake stared at George for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not a happy smile. A smile that said everything he needed to say without any words. No, Blake said simply. I won't. He turned and started walking toward the exit. The cameras followed him. Every single one. This was live television gold, and everyone knew it. George called after him, his voice getting desperate now. Blake! Blake, get back here! We're not done! Blake didn't even turn around. He just kept walking, his boots echoing on the studio floor. The audience started clapping again, louder this time, cheering even. They were on their feet. George looked around wildly, trying to figure out what to do. His producers were probably screaming in his ear through his earpiece. The cameras were still on him. The whole world was watching him lose control of his own show. Fine. George shouted after Blake, Leave! You're done here anyway. You're kicked off this show. Do you hear me? You're banned from Good Morning America. Blake stopped. Right at the edge of the stage, right before he would disappear behind the curtain, he stopped. He turned around slowly and looked back at George one final time. The entire studio held its breath. What was Blake going to say? Was he going to come back and really let George have it? Was this about to get even more intense? Blake just shook his head, disappointed, sad even, like he couldn't believe it had come to this. You know what the saddest part is? Blake said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. I actually used to respect you. I used to think you were one of the good ones, someone who actually cared about having real conversations with people. George opened his mouth to respond, but Blake wasn't done. But this? Blake continued, gesturing at the set, at George, at everything. This is just sad, man. You've become exactly what everyone says you've become. Someone who tears people down to make yourself feel important. Those words hit different. You could see it on George's face. That stung. That really stung. Get out, George said quietly, his voice shaking now. Get out of my studio. Blake nodded slowly, gladly, and then he was gone, just like that. Blake Shelton walked off the Good Morning America set and never looked back. George stood there for a moment, looking lost. The cameras were still on him. The audience was still watching, and he had no idea what to do. He tried to laugh it off, tried to play it cool. Well, folks, that was unexpected. But nobody was buying it. The audience sat back down, but the energy was gone. The show was ruined. George had destroyed his own interview, pushed away one of the biggest stars in country music, and done it all on live television in front of millions of people. He tried to continue, tried to move on to the next segment like nothing happened, but his hands were shaking. His voice was unsteady. He kept glancing toward the exit where Blake had disappeared, like maybe he was hoping Blake would come back and they could start over. But Blake was done. Completely done. Behind the scenes, you could only imagine the chaos. Producers scrambling, executives freaking out, everyone trying to figure out how to do damage control on something that had just been broadcast live to the entire country. But there was no controlling it, no spinning it. Everyone had seen exactly what happened. They had watched George Stephanopoulos, the so-called professional journalist, insult and belittle a guest until that guest had had enough and walked out. And the worst part for George? The audience had sided with Blake, completely and totally. They had clapped for him, cheered for him, supported him as he stood up for himself against a host who had forgotten what it meant to treat people with basic human decency. In the control room, the producers were making calls, big calls, the kind of calls that happen when something goes catastrophically wrong on live television. They were probably calling Blake's team, trying to apologize, trying to fix this. But what could they say? Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew who was in the wrong. George finished the show somehow, stumbled through the rest of the segments, but it didn't matter. Nothing else that happened that morning mattered. The only thing anyone would remember, the only thing anyone would talk about, was Blake Shelton's exit. Because it wasn't just an exit, it was a statement, a line in the sand, a moment where someone said enough is enough. I'm not going to let you treat me this way. Not for ratings, not for drama, not for anything. Blake had given George every chance to correct course, every opportunity to turn the interview around, to ask real questions, to have an actual conversation. But George had chosen to keep pushing, keep insulting, keep trying to make Blake look small so he could look big. And it had backfired, spectacularly. The audience had seen a man stand up for himself with grace and dignity. They had seen him try to stay calm, try to be professional, try to rise above it. And when it became clear that wasn't going to work, when it became obvious that George had no intention of showing him any respect, they had seen him make the brave choice to walk away. That's what made it so powerful. Blake didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't throw anything or make a scene beyond what was necessary to make his point. He simply refused to participate in his own humiliation. He refused to sit there and smile while someone tore him down. And George had shown everyone exactly who he was. Not the polished television personality, not the respected journalist, but someone who would use his platform to bully a guest. Someone who would prioritize his own ego over basic human kindness. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Blake walked out of that studio with his head held high. He had defended himself, stood his ground, refused to be treated like he was less than, and millions of people had watched him do it. George was left standing on his own set, in his own studio, having just kicked off one of the biggest stars in country music. But he hadn't won, not even close. He had lost the audience, lost the respect of everyone watching, lost any moral high ground he might have thought he had, because at the end of the day, it didn't matter what title George had. Didn't matter that it was his show, his studio, his stage. He had forgotten the most basic rule of being a good host, a good interviewer, a good person. Treat people with respect. Blake Shelton had reminded everyone of that rule, not with a speech, not with a lecture, but by simply refusing to accept anything less, by walking away from a situation where he wasn't being valued or respected. And that 41-second moment when George made that smug comment about Blake's career being over, that was the spark that lit the fuse. That was the moment that set everything in motion, the moment that proved you can only push someone so far before they push back. Blake had tried to laugh it off, tried to be the bigger person, tried to keep things professional. But when George kept coming, kept pushing, kept insulting, Blake made a choice to value himself more than he valued being on that show. It was a lesson everyone watching would remember, about self-respect, about knowing your worth, about refusing to let anyone, no matter who they are or what platform they have, make you feel small. George had wanted drama, had wanted headlines, had wanted a moment that would get people talking. Well, he got it, just not the way he had planned. Not as the clever host who asked tough questions, but as the bully who pushed too far and lost everything. The cameras had captured it all, every word, every expression, every moment of tension building, until it finally exploded into that unforgettable exit. Blake Shelton walking away, George Stephanopoulos shouting after him, the audience on their feet. the studio in chaos, and millions of people at home watching it all unfold, unable to believe what they were seeing. It was the kind of television, the moment that would be replayed forever, analyzed, discussed, debated, but no matter how many times people watched it, no matter how many different angles they examined it from, the conclusion would always be the same. Blake Shelton was the good guy. George Stephanopoulos had crossed the line. And when someone disrespects you that badly, sometimes the only thing left to do is walk away. That's exactly what Blake did. And he did it with more class and dignity than George had shown during the entire interview. The microphone Blake had dropped on the chair sat there for the rest of the show. A physical reminder of what had happened, of the guest who had enough self-respect to leave rather than be disrespected. George glanced at it a few times during the broadcast. You could see him looking at it, thinking about it, maybe even regretting it. But it was too late. The damage was done. The moment was over. Blake was gone. And Good Morning America would never be quite the same after that morning. The morning when Blake Shelton said no, when he refused to play along, when he chose himself over the show, it was 41 seconds from smug comment to complete chaos. 41 seconds that changed everything. 41 seconds that reminded everyone watching that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to accept disrespect. George had thought he was in control, thought he could say whatever he wanted, thought his position as host gave him the right to belittle his guests. Blake had proven him wrong, had shown him that respect goes both ways. That being on television doesn't give you permission to be cruel. The lesson was clear, the message was powerful, and Blake Shelton had delivered both without raising his voice, without losing his cool, without doing anything except standing up for himself. That's what real strength looks like. Not dominating someone, not using your power to make others feel small, but knowing when to walk away, knowing your worth, knowing that some battles aren't worth fighting because the person you're fighting with has already lost. George had lost the moment he decided to insult Blake's career, had lost when he called him sensitive, had lost when he demanded Blake sit down like he was a child. Every choice he made pushed him further away from any possibility of redemption. And Blake? Blake had won by refusing to play the game, by not giving George what he wanted, by taking away the one thing George thought he had: control. The audience knew it, the viewers knew it, and deep down, George knew it too. You could see it in his face as Blake walked away. That moment of realization that he had just made a massive mistake, that he had pushed someone too far and there was no taking it back. Blake Shelton got kicked off Good Morning America that day. But really, he had walked off on his own terms, with his dignity intact, with the support of everyone who had watched what happened, with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. George had technically gotten what he said he wanted. Blake was banned from the show. But at what cost? His reputation, his credibility, the respect of his audience, all of it gone in the span of one disastrous interview. Sometimes the person who walks away is the real winner. Sometimes refusing to engage is the most powerful move you can make. Blake Shelton proved that beyond any doubt. And 41 seconds was all it took for one smug comment to destroy everything George thought he had built. 41 seconds to remind the world that respect matters, that kindness matters, that how you treat people matters. Blake walked out of that studio and never looked back. And he didn't have to, because everyone looking at that moment knew exactly who the good guy was, who had handled themselves with class, who had stood up for what was right. It wasn't the host sitting in his chair, desperately trying to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. It was the guest who had the courage to say enough is enough. The guest who valued himself more than he valued being on television. The guest who walked away with his head held high while the host was left scrambling to pick up the pieces of the disaster he had created. That's what happens when you forget that the person sitting across from you is a human being. When you forget that fame and success don't make someone immune to disrespect. When you forget that everyone has a breaking point, Blake Shelton reached his. And what he did next became the most talked about moment in Good Morning America history. Not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to tolerate. And that made all the difference.